Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our Wellness Wednesday webinar series. I believe this is the fourth in our 8-part series about aspects of wellness and living with epilepsy. I'm Amy Haugen, the Senior Regional Manager at the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota, and I'm happy to be here co-hosting this presentation, and I'll introduce our guest speaker in just a bit. Just want to go through some housekeeping items for everyone. This is a 75-minute webinar. Please plan to be here for the whole webinar so that you get all of the information. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available as a recording at a later date on our website, and you will be notified of when that is available as well. So please share it with any and everyone that you feel would benefit from the content. If you are having struggles with your bandwidth, if we're choppy in how we're talking, or you are having any breakup in your screen or sound, it's recommended that you close out any things that you are not using, and specifically things like music or streaming services can really cut into your bandwidth and make the experience a little bit more difficult. Upon completion, you will receive a certificate of attendance to this webinar to be used as you see fit. That will come to you in 2 to 3 business days after the webinar as well. I just want to let you know that the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota is hosting this webinar, but it is the majority of the content will be provided by Ozum and Ellie Wilson, the executive director there. So we are sharing this information to inform you about aspects of epilepsy and other health conditions and social relationships, but anything related to treatment or specific to your medical diagnosis should be asked of your medical provider. Just want to let you know how we plan to do questions during the webinar. You will notice that the chat is disabled for all of you. That's because we really wanted to make it simple, and you should see in the middle bottom part of your screen an icon that says Q&A. If you click on that, it will open a box that will allow you to add in any questions that you may have. We really encourage questions and type them in as you have them. We will take time at the end for about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, where you will be able to get the answers to those questions. If you have a question that's related to the technology piece, like I can't hear or I'm not seeing clearly, our tech person will try to assist you with that. But the Q&A will be done at the end of the session. So please feel free to add anything in as you have the question. We're going to just take a quick minute to do a poll question. We always like to know what everyone's connection to epilepsy is for our webinar. So you should see a poll right now. And we're going to give you about a minute to check. You can check more than one. And what is your relationship to epilepsy? Your choices are that you have epilepsy, you have another family member, a child, a friend, or a coworker. Maybe you've lost someone, your parent has epilepsy, your spouse or partner has epilepsy, or you work with people with epilepsy. And so feel free to click as many of those as pertain to you, because we know that there are also times where you have more than one relationship to epilepsy. Looks like we are just over halfway. Now we're about 2/3 have responded. Thank you for responding. We'll give it just a few more seconds. All right, if we can finish up with our voting, and in about 10 seconds, we'll have Mary close the poll and we'll share the results with you. Mary, you can go ahead and close that poll now. And the result is, as you can see, we have this is just fantastic to see that we have lots of different responses. So majority have epilepsy, but we do have a significant number who have a family member who has epilepsy, and we have a few joining who have lost someone, and a few that have joined who have are working in a space where there are people with epilepsy. So thank you so much. It's good to see the variety of people that are joining us on our webinar. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll results. I just want to share with you what our objectives tonight are. Our objectives are to increase our knowledge of how epilepsy and seizures can impact social relationships, to understand why social relationships matter in life and why they're important, and how to set some goals or guidelines for ourselves around social interactions and relationships, and then to gain some tangible tools and resources related to how to strategize building and strengthening social relationships. So we have 4 of those objectives, and we hope that by the end you will have information that you can say you have learned enough to check all 4 of those off. We're going to start tonight, though, by giving just a brief background on seizures and epilepsy. We always start that on all of our webinars, just to level the playing field for everyone's knowledge base. So we're going to talk about what is a seizure, what is epilepsy, and then some statistics before we dive into the social relationship piece. So all of you had a relationship to epilepsy who responded, but just to remind everybody, a seizure is a finite event that occurs in the brain. And by finite, I mean there's a definite start and a definite stop to the event. And what it is uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain. So as our brain is able to function, there are millions of brain cells communicating all of the time for us to function. Everything from talking, walking, breathing, everything we do is managed by our brain and our neuron or brain cells. When there is unexpected surge in electrical activity, or there's a miscommunication, so a misfiring, if you will, in the brain, a seizure can occur. We all have what's called a seizure threshold. And a seizure threshold means that given enough stress, each one of our brains could seize, but we all have a different threshold. And so for those of us who have epilepsy, we probably have a lower threshold. For those of us who don't have epilepsy, it would take a bit more, or a lot more even, for our brain to actually manifest itself in a physical seizure. So just keeping in mind that seizures are finite events that occur as a part of other diagnoses. They can occur with other conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about this before I introduce Ellie, but we know that some of the most common coexisting conditions are autism, depression and anxiety. We know that sleep conditions have a high occurrence rate along with epilepsy as well. So you can have seizures that are related to those. And we also know that there are conditions where a seizure can occur that are not epilepsy related. A good example of this is someone who has diabetes. If their blood sugar is out of control, they could have a seizure that will look similar or the same even as a seizure that might be related to epilepsy, but it's related to their diabetes and their blood sugar not being regulated in that moment. And then we know that seizures occur a lot of different ways. So you can see our brain that lights up here, all the different lobes of the brain. We know that for some people, seizures that are occurring are impacting their speech. Some are impacting their movement. Some are just impacting their senses, like they smell or hear something different. So seizures can impact, depending on the type of seizure and where it occurs, can look really different and impact different parts of our everyday functioning in different ways. So epilepsy is the medical condition that has seizures as the main component. And so neurological, there's 3 words here that are key to know: neurological, unprovoked, and reoccurrent. So neurological means basically occurring in the brain. Seizures occur in the, epilepsy occurs in the brain, and it's typically unprovoked and reoccurrence are the 2 main things that have to occur before epilepsy is diagnosed. So unprovoked means not caused by another medical condition or another situation. Like I mentioned, an example is diabetes. Another example is high fevers. Febrile seizures are the #1 reason for unprovoked, or one of the #1 reasons for provoked seizures, especially in young children. In epilepsy, they're unprovoked. They originate in the brain, and it's not related to another medical condition. And then reoccurrent, meaning more than one. There are a few very specific epilepsy syndromes where one seizure will lead to that diagnosis, but that is because it is a known component of that syndrome or that diagnosis. But for most people, they have to have more than one before they get a diagnosis. We also know that people call epilepsy different things. We've heard the term seizure disorder and seizure condition. At the Epilepsy Foundation, we use the term epilepsy because it is the historical term. If you're researching epilepsy, you will get the best results and most reliable information if you use the word epilepsy, but we also recognize that it's a personal choice. And many people with epilepsy choose to say they have a seizure disorder because that's their comfort level and that's how they describe what they are experiencing. So we know that it does have multiple different names. I'm going to dive a little bit into telling you about how prevalent it is, because we feel this is really important information to bring to light how common epilepsy is. We know that 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime. That's a super high number. And we know that not only is there that 1 in 26, but the higher incident rate is that 1 in 10 people will have a single seizure in their lifetime. So oftentimes when we do our trainings that are about how do you respond to a seizure, we talk about 1 in 10 people will have a seizure. So it might not be somebody with epilepsy that an individual might have to respond to. It might be just somebody having that single event. But as it relates to epilepsy, it is 1 in 26. And if we put that into some numbers that make sense as far as where we live, it's about 54,000 people in the state of Minnesota. And every year there are over 200,000 new cases diagnosed in the United States. We know that it occurs quite often or quite frequently. The only things that occur more frequently in the neurological world are migraines, stroke, and Alzheimer's. And it is the leading brain condition in children. A lot of times has to do with brain development, especially in those 0 to 4 ages. There are some other statistics that we like to bring to light as well, in that of those who have epilepsy, about 1/3 of them have what we call uncontrolled. You might hear refractory, you might hear intractable, but it means uncontrolled seizures, where their treatment plan, they're at a stage in their in their diagnosis for the treatment that they are receiving is not getting their seizures under control. It may be because it's fairly new to them and their physician is working with them to get the right treatment plan, or it might be that they happen to fall within that category where they're going to have uncontrolled seizures because of the nature of their diagnosis. And then we know that adults who have epilepsy have, they're more likely to have 4 or more co-occurring conditions. And the top ones that we will mention are anxiety, depression, and sleep conditions. And so sleep conditions are one of those areas where we know over 40% of people with epilepsy also have a sleep disorder, and seizure control can really be impacted by sleep. So that's one of those key things to also just know in general. When you look at people across the United States and the demographics of epilepsy, people with low economic status are 2 to 4 times more likely to have seizures. We know it impacts African Americans and Hispanics. About 40% of those who have epilepsy fall into those 2 racial groups. And what's interesting about that is African Americans account for African Americans and Hispanics account for about 31% of the total population in the United States. And yet 40% of those with epilepsy fall into those 2 races. So you can see the little bit of the disproportionate number. 1/3 of children with epilepsy live in what we call food insecure homes. And about 50% of adults with active epilepsy live in a home with less than $25,000 as an annual income. And we bring these 2 things to light because epilepsy is expensive. There's lots of reasons for these last 2. It could be related to the cost of epilepsy, be it medical costs, medication, or treatment costs. It could be because parents aren't able to work full-time jobs related to having to care for their child, or adults might not even be able to hold full-time jobs depending on how their epilepsy is being controlled or not controlled. So honestly, some stark statistics there, but it makes the work that we do even more meaningful to try and bring those numbers down as well. All right, we're gonna transition now over to our guest speaker and to talking about social relationships and navigating those social relationships. And I just wanted to start by giving you this definition of social relationships. We are a part of the National Epilepsy Foundation, or it's also called the Epilepsy Foundation of America. And they have a wellness institute that looks at the 8 components of wellness. And one of the things in this component of social relationships is defining what does it mean to be in social relationships. And it really is the connections that we have with other people, our friends, our family, our loved ones, our community support. And those relationships are what build our community of support. And so just to give you that baseline of what we mean when we say social relationships. I want to take a minute to introduce Ellie Wilson, who's the executive director, of AUSM, the Autism Society of Minnesota, and tell you a little bit about why Ellie is joining us, why from the Autism Society. And Ellie has been a part of another webinar with me. I've been blessed and fortunate to be able to join her for 2 webinars that EFMN has put on. And what we know about epilepsy and autism is they do occur more commonly together. But not only that, but in the world of autism and in the world of epilepsy, there are some commonalities about what it means to build social relationships, what it means to find spaces to connect with other people, and what it means to live with things like anxiety and depression related to the diagnosis of autism or related to the diagnosis of epilepsy. So we share some commonalities in some of those mental health components for our disorders, to be honest. And because they can be co-occurring, but also because we share those commonalities, it made great sense to us to have Ellie join us and to share her expertise about social relationships and establishing those relationships and the importance of them. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellie. And then I will join back at the end and I will let you take it away, Ellie.
Cool. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. As Amy says, this is something we've done once before and something I hope we will do many times again in the future. In case any of you are local to Minnesota specifically, I just want you to know sort of what an important thing it is that our organizations, even though it seems like we're serving different parts of the disability community, we love to work together. Our powers combined are pretty impressive, and whether we're working on education or community building events like this, or if we're working on legislation that, for instance, improves the lives of people who live in our state and are part of the communities we love. These are just really great opportunities to have, and I'm very thankful and I'm very glad that you know the Epilepsy Foundation, because they are a top-notch organization and we love to work with them at AUSM. So let me tell you a bit about AUSM. Even if you don't have autism, let me just, I got to do it. I'm the executive director. This is what they pay me the big bucks for. So AUSM has been around 50 years. This year is the 50th. And we started as a parent-driven organization back in the 70s when there were a bunch of parents who had autistic kids whose needs weren't getting met in the community. They really identified as a grassroots organization. And over the past many decades, we have evolved and changed so much. But here are the 2 things I want you to know. Whether or not you have autism, you might know someone who does. We serve 2 purposes at our organization. One is to support autistic people and the people that love them. And that means we answer all kinds of questions, make all kinds of referrals, and do all kinds of training events that are directly oriented around autistic people. But we also wised up a couple decades back and realized that the more we work with everyone else in the community who isn't necessarily directly part of the disability community, that's when we realized we could start making a huge impact in the landscape of what it's like to live in Minnesota or in our little part of the country. So we train emergency responders and doctors and nurses and teachers and librarians and people that work at zoos and everybody that you could possibly imagine. And if that's something that you're interested in, we would love to meet you anytime you're ready to come in and find us. Okay, next slide. Let's talk a little bit about these social relationships that we're trying to build. Of course, as Amy indicated, in the autism space, we talk about the importance of social relationships all the time. Now, I do understand, and partially because I've been hanging with Amy and Mary and Debbie at the Epilepsy Foundation, I know that the exact needs of our communities don't overlap totally. So what we're not going to be talking about today is about those sort of fundamental social skills in understanding, social behavior and how to sort of interact with other people on that really elementary level. But as Amy said, what we do know is that a lot of people in our facet of the community do feel just a great level of anxiety about who are my close friends, who can I count on, how can I get more people into that category, and then how do I sustain and maintain those relationships over time, and like, what do they look like? Are they healthy relationships? Are they strong relationships? So that's what we're really going to talk about today. This was part of actually a guide that Debbie and Amy sent over to me that has to do with why social relationships are important. One of the things that all psychologists all around the world will tell you, that the greatest predictor of overall wellness, no matter how you define it, no matter how you define your happiness, is social connectedness. And the more connected we feel, the greater wellness and happiness we have. And on the other hand, the more isolated we feel, the less well and the less happy we feel. Relationships are all about a sense of belonging. And to any of you that have ever taken one of those sort of Psych 101 courses, you know that there's that sort of hierarchy of human needs. We all know we need like food and water and shelter and stuff like that. But pretty high up on our priority list is that need to feel belonging, not just with another individual person, but also in groups. I think realistically, a lot of relationships are used to problem solve. And that's not a bad thing. A lot of people will say like, well, I don't want to make relationships just because I need to rely on people. But the fact of the matter is the human condition is sort of problem solving all the time. And whether it's solving a very specific problem where you might need somebody else's skills or resources that you don't have, it can also just be about processing and feeling understood, which is oftentimes that first step, to getting to a place where you can address the challenges or things that you're trying to change in your life. There's so much great research out there that says that when we have good social relationships, we take better care of ourselves. And I think there's something intuitive about that. When you feel sort of validated and whole and happy because you realize that other people care about you too, you are more likely to engage in behaviors where you take care of yourself. And in our part of the disability community, that might mean, taking care of your sleep habits, as Amy mentioned. It could be taking care of your medications and making sure that you're sort of sticking to the schedule that keeps you healthiest. It could mean going to the gym more or going outside more, or just in general, sort of having more balance in your life. So this is not specific to epilepsy nor autism. This is part of being human, that we all, I think, understand our own self-worth better when we feel that others do. And sometimes that can be a chicken or egg situation, but I think it's important to understand about human psychology. Connection to community is obviously enormously important. And some people get a little overwhelmed in thinking like, well, I might be able to spend time with one person or one friend, but what I ultimately want is to feel part of something bigger. Again, all humans do have the desire to be connected to something that is bigger than themselves. And no matter where you live, even if you live in a place where your neighbor is a mile down the road and there's nobody closer, it doesn't mean that you can't find connection to community. Community can mean a lot of things. And that tends to be another factor that really is tied to those feelings of wellness and self-actualization. And then, of course, I don't think I have to explain this one. I bet everybody in this webinar can relate to this, is that good social connectedness is the greatest predictor of those good feelings. We feel happy, we feel content, and we feel calm when we are most connected to other people. And that those are feelings that everybody deserves to feel. And those are feelings that I know we're all a little extra hungry for after the, past 18 months where isolation or, being distant from everybody or only really being with people on the other side of a screen at best, that can be really hard. So everybody's coming to the table knowing that these feelings are very, very important to everybody and everybody deserves them. And tonight we're just going to talk about what kind of steps can we take to consider that and start to move towards doing it, because it's not always easy. Okay, next slide. Let's talk a little bit about why this is hard. It's not because we want to focus on the problem and not the solution, but like I said before, in order to solve a problem, sometimes you need to feel validated. And I think that's what this is about. I do not have a disability, but God, do I love so many people that do. And what I can tell you over and over again is that a lot of disabled people in my life say that the hardest part of their disability aren't the direct symptoms, it's some of the isolation that tends to follow a diagnosis. Now, in the epilepsy community, of course, there's a high likelihood of fear of incident. A lot of people feel social anxiety in general, but the kind of anxiety I'm talking about is a little bit more rational, in that, like, you have to consider and plan for what could happen at any particular place, or if I'm with a new person. And those anxieties are valid and important to consider, and we can work with them rather than against them. But in the big picture, they do tend to cause a certain reluctance to try to participate in social relationships or in social situations. And we're here to say that everybody who works at the Epilepsy Foundation and at the Autism Society really understands that. And that's not something that anybody has to hide or feel bad about, but it is something that we can talk about a little more openly so we can start to loosen the grip of what that anxiety feels like. We know that many people with disabilities rely on logistical things that don't always come together perfectly when you're trying to plan for social interactions. For instance, if you rely on public transportation, you might feel limited in the spaces where you can actually go to spend time. Or, if you're in, what are the two seasons in Minnesota, winter and construction, when you are reliant on those things and they just aren't cooperating with you to, keep on time, or, when plans have to get canceled or shifted, that also adds a level of stress. So we do understand. I know so many people that are worried that people will not like them anymore if they find out that they have a disability or a diagnosis. And they do feel like that stigma is really real. And that stigma is complex and tricky sometimes. It's not always just a blanket, will this person like me, yes or no. There are all kinds of cultural implications that affect stigma. And depending on which cultural communities you participate in, and I'm not just talking about ethnic communities, but all levels of culture, you can kind of be dealing with different levels of stigma. And again, that's something that we recognize and are working really hard to change with all of our loved ones who are affected by epilepsy or another disability. Over at Awesome, we talk about executive function a lot. Executive function is essentially your ability, no matter who you are, to organize multiple functions of your life. And that can mean things like time management. It can mean things like making sort of strategic plans that have multiple parts, or making a backup plan for the first plan that you have. Executive function is not associated with intelligence. I know so many brilliant people who have really low executive function, but I think that it's fair to say that sometimes, because of things associated with our disability, we can acknowledge that keeping up with a social life and keeping up with social commitments does take some of those organizational skills, so that you can make sure that you're keeping the promises or the commitments that you make. And so you can kind of keep track of everything. And then finally, what Amy talked about before is, I think, the biggest thing on the table, which is that sometimes when we have a diagnosis, we are experiencing chronic and long-term stress we might be more prone to anxiety or depression. And these are the things that, you know, anxiety and depression are not inherently bad things, but one of the hardest parts about them is that they tend to contribute to that desire, or that instinct rather, to remain isolated, when really it's the opposite of isolation that tends to undo some of those really hard challenges. So we get it. We're just here to say, we know these barriers are real. There are some of them we can attack with a plan and some good resources, and there are others that we have to nurture in ourselves over time. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is how to do that. Next. So one of the first things that we care to address, and I can't make judgments about all of you. I don't know what kind of relationships are exactly motivating to all of you, or even how old you are, or where you come from, or what you're interested in. But I do know that a lot of people at the Autism Society who come to me are focused on different kinds of relationships. Some are really interested in being in romantic relationships. Some are really trying to build friendships. Some are trying to have better relationships with their family members or their coworkers. All of those relationships are important parts of our daily life. I think the most common thing that happens, though, is that people are so focused on the new relationships that they want to build that they kind of skip over the part where they think about the relationships that they already have. And I don't want to take anybody's life for granted. And, you know, I have a great family, and I know not everybody feels as close with their family inherently, but most of the time we have some sort of family members who are in our immediate circle. And one of the things that I just want to touch on before we kind of get into general friendships is something that we think about at Awesome a lot. And you probably have thought about this too. And I think it's something that we're going to start talking about more and better in the disability community. And that's this idea of independence. I don't know what your politics are, and it doesn't really matter. There are some people that think that our obsession with independence is all about like capitalism and individualism. And I'm not necessarily here to take on those enormous topics that I know nothing about. I think what I do know is that we try, even in advocacy, we try to tell people with disabilities all the time, you can be independent. You deserve to make choices. You deserve to have freedoms. You deserve to, frankly, have the dignity of failure, is something that we talk about in the autism community a lot, is that you don't need to live in a little bubble where you're dependent on other people all the time. But I think even though we kind of were tooting that horn for a very long time, I think a better concept that is evolving and that resonates with more people, regardless of their level of disability or their age, is this concept of interdependence. There is nobody I know who lives their life in total independence. Even if you live alone, we are all dependent on other people for stuff all the time. And whether it's your boss or your coworkers at work or your teachers or your parents or your siblings or your spouse or whoever it is, we as, you know, primates are dependent on other people. So it's not so much that the goal is to be totally independent all the time. It's to understand that interdependence is the goal, that we want to be dependent on people for some things, but we want to feel that those relationships are healthy and that everybody sort of has the right level of control and contribution to those relationships. So even when we get into talking about friendships and what we can get from them and what makes them healthy, I just wanted to sort of point out to you guys that we're just on the cusp of thinking better about this. And I would invite you to start introducing the concept of interdependence into your family, into your, you know, partner relationship, into your friends, because being dependent on people is not bad. We just got to keep everything in balance. We also have some tools at the Autism Society where we talk about routines and traditions. This is something that can be really important in working on your existing relationship, for instance, with your family. We know family relations are complex and have a lot of history and have a lot of layers. We're all kind of our hardest on our own families. I know that's true in my family. And sometimes it can feel like you got to get over a lot of hurdles in order to regain that level of healthy relationship with your family. At Awesome, we talk a lot about the logistics of doing that and how building routines, expected routines, and really regular routines, as well as, well-loved traditions with your family, even if they aren't based on any holidays or religions or anything like that, those can be the stepping stones to strong relationships that you can count on over time. And if that's something that you're interested in checking out, we definitely invite you to go to our website and look at our interdependence campaign, because that's where we talk about some of those strategies. And I know Amy would agree that sometimes your whole life may not necessarily be about your epilepsy diagnosis or the seizure that you had or whatever else. And that's okay. We understand that people are complex. However, as we run these organizations, we know what the experience is of people who come to our support groups, and we know the kind of connection and validation and resource sharing and just sense of belonging that you can get when you join in with people who have a similar experience or have been through something very similar to what you have been. So we do definitely encourage you to consider, disability support groups to help better connect you to this community, because you are a part of us and we are happy to, help you build those relationships in the settings that we help to facilitate. But let's get into the part that I think you want to really talk about, which is just sort of general friendship. So let's go to the next part. If you actually break down relationships, and we do this a lot in the autism community, we realize that there's a sum of many parts. It's kind of a different challenge to start a relationship versus build it versus hold on to it, especially if that's somebody that you want to hold on to over a long time and potentially through a lot of life transitions or ups and downs that both of you might experience. And sort of leaving room for people to change and getting to letting a relationship evolve over time. And if you do fall apart, what happens so that you can kind of get back together? Those are all different examples of parts of relationship. So we don't want to overcomplicate things tonight. I just want to tell you when I intend to be specific, that some of these strategies are kind of meant for different phases of relationships in general. Next. Before we talk about, how many relationships can we rack up, whether it's friendships or otherwise, one thing that I think is inordinately important to just say is that we're always interested in quality over quantity. And no matter how sort of extroverted or introverted you are, all people, regardless of diagnosis, disability, religion, color, background, whatever, we all deserve healthy relationships. And healthy relationships is something that I think that our parents and our grandparents didn't necessarily talk about in the same way that we talk about now. We don't have to click on it from this slide, but if this link is active, great. And if not, we can definitely send you our website so that you can find it. But because this is something that so many autistic people really need to focus on, is how to both assess and maintain healthy relationships. We did create a guide, and basically it takes the many components of a relationship, whether it's responsibility, who's responsible for what in the relationship, how do you manage emotions when they come up, whether it's love or whether it's disappointment or hurt. How do you cope with those emotions between two people? As I mentioned before, what about levels of independence and control? And what about communication? Now, this is not a formal model for all relationships, but these are the things that we think are the cornerstones of really being able to think about, yes, I'm really excited to be in this friendship, but is it good for me? And am I good for it? And if this is something that you would care to know a little bit more about, we have an entire guide where, for instance, you can take sort of one thing that all of us deal with, like criticism. I have friends who I love very much. I have friends who I love who will never, ever criticize me no matter what I do. And like, sometimes someone probably should and help me, do better at whatever I'm doing. I have other friends who are much more direct. And how do I know if their criticism is healthy and helpful to me, or if it's something that's sort of skirting into the area of, oh, that actually kind of hurts my feelings and makes me feel bad, and it might change my perspective of myself. Relationships are full of complex dynamics, and one little word like criticism can mean so many things to so many different people. In the autism community, that kind of nuance is the sort of thing that we have to talk about directly all the time. And so we made this guide that helps to really, it's a really good tool for someone who is really trying to take stock of their social relationships, of like, what are the indicators I can look for to sort of really know what relationships are best for me, because it can be hard to know. So please check it out. I'm so proud that my staff made that tool. I'm so glad that they are working on things that are productive and practical and helpful. And the cherry on top is that it was made entirely by disabled folks, all of whom have autism or other diagnoses. And so it really comes from people who walk this walk, and I think really have studied where the sticking points are in healthy relationships. Next. So it seems like I'm always talking about what comes before the relationships, but I'm telling you, this is where the hard stuff is. Sometimes, I think all the time actually, there's a reality that even if you're a giving person, even if you're trying to get into a relationship because you know you have something to give and not necessarily something that you want to take, which by the way is a great thing, we still got to make sure that we have the mental health and the emotional health and just the sort of readiness for being in those relationships. In the autism world, we talk about something called spoon theory a lot. And I have no idea why it's spoon specifically. I should probably look into this. But spoon theory basically says, look, you start every day with the same number of spoons. And every time you do anything, it kind of costs you a spoon, and sort of the easy stuff might not cost very many spoons, and the harder stuff might cost a lot of spoons. And the whole point is that if you give all your spoons away to everything else and you don't have any gas left in the tank to be able to take on the energy that you need to have in order to really actively participate in relationships, that's another really important barrier. Now, sometimes those who live in the epilepsy community or the autism community, a lot of their spoons are taken up by things that are related to their diagnosis. Anxiety can take up a lot of spoons, no matter what it's related to. And so what we have to think about is not only what do we need to do to understand how we spend our spoons throughout each day or each week or each lifetime, but rather what do we need to do to replenish them? Some people talk about like oxygen masks. Some people talk about, just gas in the tank. But the overall thing here is you are the best version of yourself as a friend when you are kind of managing yourself to the point where you have the most to give. And it doesn't mean that you have to have your life perfect and all figured out. It means you need to be able to draw from a certain level of energy so that you can tend to relationships in a way that maintains healthiness right from the beginning. Not everybody cares about self-awareness as much as I do, but I have so many interesting conversations about self-awareness where it comes to like deciding what is it that I really want? How do I best operate socially? We're all so different from each other. You can tell I'm a fast talker. I like to make little jokes. I like to make little comments. I like to make sure that I talk to 100 people every single day. I'm extremely extroverted, and that's extremely fulfilling for me to be constantly engaging with other people. You might know plenty of other people that are exactly the opposite. They might be really introverted. And one of the best ways that introversion and extroversion has ever been really described to me is that it's not whether or not you prefer social connection. It's that when you are interacting with other people, you may like it, no matter whether you're introverted or extroverted. But if you're introverted, you got to understand that it takes a little bit of energy for you to interface with another person. And if you're extroverted, you know that it kind of gives you energy to be able to interact with another person. Knowing that about yourself so that you are kind of accurately able to hold your own sense of energy along with the other things you're dealing with, like maybe anxiety or depression or other things. This is just a really good thing to know about yourself. My brother, who's 2 years younger than me and couldn't be more different in a lot of ways, he has a tremendous amount of social anxiety, but he's super extroverted. So he's in this tricky situation where it makes him incredibly nervous to take on social situations, and yet social situations are the thing that make him feel full and complete and like his tank is full and he can go do other stuff that's hard for him. So we don't always get the most convenient mix of these characteristics, but it's good things to think about. Knowing your tools for anxiety. Everybody's anxiety management is a little bit different. Knowing how to plan for desired interactions and what you actually want to do. And that's something that we're going to talk about in a little bit. At Awesome, we talk about any regulation strategies that you might need in order to manage your diagnosis while you're hanging out with other people. So my friend Jillian Nelson, who helped write some parts of this presentation, who's an autistic adult and the head of our advocacy department at Awesome, she makes a sensory schedule so that even if, let's say, she's going to go to the state fair with a friend, she knows that even though that's a highly desirable and pleasant social interaction for her, there's going to be stuff about it that's going to tire her out or overwhelm her, and she's got a plan to sort of deal with that. There might be other things related to just sort of safety or anxiety or anything else. And so that's another little thing to think. We also can think about our cultural inventory. What cultures, what communities do we belong to? And like I said, it's not always your ethnic community. You might be part of a whole bunch of cultures, and really thinking about what those are, because the more you know about yourself, the more you're going to understand the different levels with which you can connect with other people. And you're going to have a little bit more ideas as to how to approach a particular cultural group, because you're just going to have a little bit more detail when you think about that. So all of these things have tools online that you can just Google. The number of personality tests and all that sort of stuff out there. I won't tell you which ones are my favorites and which ones I think are total baloney, but they're there, and it's a good place to start if you're just feeling stuck. And like the first thing you want to do is just say like, okay, how can I get to a place where I can set some goals about this? And we've already talked about balance. Quality over quantity is really important. And understanding that you don't have to get the same thing from every relationship. When I think about, the many blessed friendships that I have, I sure as heck don't get the same thing from any two people. I go to some people when I need comfort. I go to other people when I need to just laugh and have a good time. I go to another person when I might want to talk about something with my career, or I might talk about, there's only certain people that I might want to talk about something I'm embarrassed of. Everybody can provide something different, and no one person provides all of those things to one. All right. So one thing you might be thinking about is your choice to disclose to the people that you are interested in building relationships with. It can be really important for people to be aware, and I can't tell you what to do, and I wouldn't presume to. I know disclosure is a very, very personal choice, and it can be really contextual and really depend on a lot of different circumstances. But what I'm here to just encourage you to do is to find a way to talk about your diagnosis or your disability with people that are new. Because I don't know, I know from experience, I know from hanging with so many people over time that if you try to compartmentalize and keep that away from people for too long, sometimes it can just come back to bite you in the butt. And it's a lot. I think it builds anxiety for people if they're constantly trying to keep things separate and hidden from people. But what I just want you to know is that it doesn't mean that you have to give people your full diagnosis and all the nitty-gritty details every time that you're meeting someone new. over at Awesome, we tell people the difference between hard and soft disclosure. So some people really like to say, hey, I'm Jillian and I have autism spectrum disorder, and this is what that means, and this is what I have trouble with, and this is what I'm great at. Other people like to do a little spoon feeding. I'm bad at keeping in touch. Please don't take it personally. I get overwhelmed in crowds. So if we could please maybe go somewhere where it could be a little quieter. Those sorts of things are versions of disclosure, even if you don't feel ready to give them the whole kit and caboodle. It can be important for people to know that you may appear uninterested in being included even when you are. I think a lot of people who have social anxiety, that's something that other people can read, and that's okay. It's not your fault. It's not bad, but it is something that can be misleading to people who might be perfectly happy to know you and to know you better, frankly. So just thinking about the ways in which you are willing to communicate what your interests are and what your hopes are, that is something that we can work on over time. Friends can always be told about your diagnosis if they don't know already, but it is kind of good to prepare that explanation. Some people like to practice it or script it. Some people, prefer to just sort of fly by the seat of their pants and figure it out based on the situation. Again, I'm not here to tell you what to do, but people just have so much anxiety around this. And sometimes the antidote to anxiety is having a plan and kind of getting into a groove where you know what you're going to say every time. So that's just something that we encourage you to think about. This is from Jillian herself. This is what she told me to tell you. She said the importance of disclosure for her. So her advice to you, not mine, is tell your friends. If they're friends, they're still going to like you. Disclosure gives our friends a chance to learn and to know how to support us. And of course, the autism community is pretty well known for having people that have a lot of different funky interests and behaviors that make us sort of stand out. That's a big part of autism in the first place. So we talk all the time about leaning in instead of leaning out. Be yourself. That's what really matters the most. And if you ever find that, whatever systems you've created for yourself are all about hiding parts of yourself from people, let that red flag go up and know that that's going to interrupt the level of connectedness that you're really looking for. Love Jillian, that slide. Okay, so how do we actually meet people? Again, this is experience that we have a lot of at Awesome because a lot of autistic people need this kind of help. Usually what we do is we say, start with any network that you're a part of and see if you can build out. So if you or your loved one is a student, what are the extracurricular activities that they can be a part of? And like these days, extracurricular activities are so much better. It used to feel like you only had two choices. You could be, a geek or a jock or that sort of stuff that we always see in the movies. But these days, I think kids and schools, private or public, no matter what, they have more variety of opportunities that don't necessarily make you feel like you have to be part of sort of one category of person. If you're willing to include friendships with people that you work with. Some people feel a little funny about that. Some people feel that there should be a boundary between work and, sort of your recreation life. But work, especially if you work in a job that you care about, work can be a really great place to meet people who care about the same stuff that you do. And it doesn't mean that we can't proceed with caution, but it does mean that, you can open your mind to what it would be like to be friends with people that you work with. If you're not comfortable doing that, I always think about what are the top couple places that you'd be willing to volunteer. Volunteerism is typically based in core values. And if you really care about something that's related to your religion and you want to volunteer that way, great. You're definitely participating amongst people who have that shared value with you. If you care about, animals or fashion or education or sports or whatever it is, those things are also going to connect you to people who share those similar core values. we invite you to participate in events. And sometimes when you feel like you kind of got to do this the training wheels way, when you're really getting going with a person to an event that you haven't tried before, we just encourage you to do it. I learned from the autism community about the robust opportunity to participate in anime conventions in the Twin Cities. That was not something I previously knew anything about. And frankly, I still don't know very much about it, but I'll tell you those events are fun. And sometimes if you can just start with a little bit of people watching and getting a sense of kind of what people are excited to sort of come and celebrate, that's a little bit different than just going to open businesses. So like, yeah, if you go to the mall, there's always going to be people there. Yeah, if you go to the park, there's always going to be people there, and that's not bad. But sometimes I think special events like concerts or craft exhibits or art exhibits or things like that, that's going to be a more direct line to people who are really interested in being there. And that's going to be a natural connection. I really believe in the power of networking. I guess that's how you become an executive director, frankly. So like, you probably are not surprised. However, I will say that some of the greatest friends that I have in my life, I didn't actually meet them first. I met someone else who knows them. And I think that one of the best habits that we can keep is being willing to say to somebody, hey, I might say to my friend Katie, like, hey, Katie, I think you and your friend Kyle seem really fun. Do you think we could ever call up Kyle and both of us could go get some coffee together? Or all three of us rather could go get some coffee together. Networking doesn't always mean like trying to accomplish a goal for your career or something like that. We all are the product of our sort of social webs, and there's so many cool activities that show how close we can be to people if we just start recognizing that we can share social networks. Finally, I think that in this day and age, it's completely acceptable and typical to use online services or apps in order to find friends. And of course, not all of them are created equal, but I think they're a perfectly acceptable, normal, good place to consider meeting other people. Next. Speaking of online apps, here are a few hot tips. Select the right ones. So I would never shame anyone. And if you're looking to meet people on Tinder, you go right ahead. But it may be that if that's the main place that you're having a profile and interacting with people, that you don't end up finding the fulfillment of a close friendship, because that's not what that app is made for. So there are all kinds of apps out there that are actually more designated for friendship building rather than just dating or like intimate relationships or things like that. So just be aware of which ones are out there, depending on which communities and cultures you feel sort of safest participating in. Here's a little bit of a tip. Even though it can be annoying, apps that use multiple verifications, like, hey, you can't log in without also putting in, that text that you get from the phone number or whatever, those are annoying, but they're good. One of the only dangers of apps and online stuff is just kind of being aware that there are people out there that might be interested in knowing something about your identity or using that information with malicious intent. I don't want you to walk around being super scared of that, but these kinds of tools that apps build in are meant to protect you. Limit your personal info in those apps. I would say it's okay to put something totally random about yourself, something that you like or some sort of secret talent that you have, but try not to put anything about your direct neighborhood or places that you like to go really frequently or other things where you could put yourself in danger of sort of exposing yourself to somebody who isn't the safest. Do appropriate research before you meet someone. I think some people think it's a faux pas to be Googling people that you might meet, but you Google to your heart's content. You get on Facebook and double check. You can always usually tell a real person from a person who just has an internet presence to do bad things. So don't feel bad about that. You're out there to protect yourself. Do that research and trust your instincts. If it ever feels to you like something isn't right, you don't owe anybody anything just because you want to make that relationship. So it's okay, trust your instincts. And of course, always first meet in a public place. But I think a lot of people these days are using these apps. And though they have risks that are associated with them, I think we can manage those risks if we use these kind of tools. Okay, next. So we already talked about using your interests to help find people and your core values, seeing the same people at events or venues, noticing someone that you see often that has an item of shared interest, whether that's a shirt that they wear. I can't tell you how many people show up at the Autism Society wearing their passions literally on their sleeves and chests and everything else. Especially if you're into certain movies or music or everything else, that's a cool thing to do. Events of like-minded people and places of shared value. So normally you don't come to a webinar and have people tell you like, hey, what are your political leanings or what kind of religion are you a part of? I wouldn't ask you those things in this setting, but those are exactly the kinds of things that are really good ways to use your radar to find people who are going to have like-mindedness to you. Now, like-mindedness is not the most valuable thing all the time. It's great to have relationships with people who are different from you. But if you're really trying to focus on building relationships because this is something you feel like is lacking from your life, I do recommend that this is where you start. And then, of course, we can tolerate and celebrate the differences that we all have. But starting with a couple of those core seeds is really great. So this next section, again, Jillian also gave a presentation. So you'll see the word neurotypical in there, which just means a non-disabled person. Jillian really wanted to talk about the barrier, which is like, yeah, I might be able to find someone that I'm interested in knowing better, but what do I actually do with them? I think that's something that a lot of people have anxiety about. So this is a little bit of her advice, although this time I do share this advice with her. And the first is try not to build up a huge number of expectations. A lot of people, especially if they watch a lot of TV or movies or watch a lot of videos, they think like, oh, when I go on the Disney Channel, like this is what friendship looks like and this is what we got to be doing. And the fact of the matter is, especially in a place where we appreciate neurodiversity, great relationships can look a lot of different ways and activities can look a lot of different ways. There's nothing right or wrong. So spending all your energy trying to do something right can make it more stressful and less pleasant. Just do yourself a favor and try not to focus on that. If you are into group gatherings, maybe you are an extroverted person, maybe you feel kind of anxious about one-on-one circumstances, and what you're really trying to do is be around a group of people. Whether or not you're kind of planning a whole thing or whether you're just assessing an activity as to whether or not it would be good for a group, think about how every group naturally has diversity, and accommodating different styles of interaction can be really important to make everyone feel comfortable. So if we can make a little effort to consider that there are kind of a couple of different activities that are available at any given venue, I think that's really cool. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a new distillery in Northeast Minneapolis called Brother Justice. That's what it's called. And I was absolutely floored to see that they had designed their entire distillery around different disabilities. And they had places where you could hang out in kind of intimate conversations where there was a stack of board games in the corner. And they had other places that were kind of more typical busy bar scene. And I just appreciated so much that in one place, there was kind of more than one option, that you weren't necessarily subjecting yourself to just one option just because you decided on a venue. And I think that finding a place that has a little flexibility or an activity that has flexibility can be super helpful. Next. Types, if you want to do small groups, one thing that you can do if you think that you might be able to connect a couple of people is thinking about what they need to know about each other. Sharing a couple of facts with people about what you know they have in common and vice versa can be the thing that sets off kind of gets that snowball rolling. We all know that the momentum of these things can build over time if you just kind of give it a nudge. And sometimes the beginning is the hardest. You know, once you get over the hump, it tends to be a little easier. Jillian's technique for managing social anxiety in these settings is consider pairing or grouping people in a way that you don't have to feel like the person that's carrying everybody. It's good for you to introduce people to each other so that you don't have to feel like you're orchestrating everyone at the same time. And then finally, one-on-one. Some people really love this because they can only focus on one person and the dynamic of one person. But of course, some people feel a lot of pressure for one-on-one gatherings because it's like, oh God, what if we run out of things to talk about? Or, you know, goodness forbid, there's a 4-second piece of silence in the middle of a conversation. None of us know how to tolerate that in 2021. So our advice for this is plan these engagements around an activity, whether it's eating. A lot of people like to go eat together, but if you're not into that, going to an event or a movie or a class or something where your conversation is not the only thing that's on the table, that can really be helpful to, try to get that snowball moving in the right direction and get the conversation going without too much pressure. Okay, we talked about having a plan. Make sure you have a plan. If there are concrete details that can make things out of your control easier, maybe it has to do with the transportation, maybe it has to do with the duration or the expectations or the intended outcome. We don't mean to say have a plan and stick to it beyond all reasonable doubt, but it is like, you know what you'll say if you think that you might need to leave, or if you need to take a break, or if you just know you're going to be feeling those feelings of anxiety. It's okay to go in with a plan. Don't feel like that's a silly thing to do. That's a super helpful way to address your anxiety. And again, what makes a good friendship, it's not just those shared interests, because of course, like I said, it's great to have relationships with people who aren't exactly the same to you. So how do we kind of move past that? Caring and showing that you care. No relationship should ever put pressure on you to spend a lot of money or to spend too much time if you don't have it. But there are so many nice things that people can do for each other that don't cost a dime. And sometimes it might just be a little message or a little note to say, hey, I'm thinking about you today. Isn't today the day you're taking that test? Or it might just mean saying like, I just want you to know I had a really good time. I'm hoping I can call you again next week so that we can spend more time together. Showing reciprocal support. Relationships do not have to be fully equal all the time. But if you are getting to know somebody and you feel like you're constantly the one that's initiating or contributing, it doesn't necessarily mean the other person is bad, but it can be a sign that you have to address the fundamental health of the relationship. Mutual understanding makes friendships really good, and that happens through commitment. I read commitment off the thing. It happens through communication and commitment and loyalty, being able to get through minor disagreements. We live in an age where people have strong feelings about a lot of stuff. And in the autism space, at least, we talk about that kind of black and white thinking that happens sometimes. If we all dismissed people who could be our friends because we disagreed about something, even if that one thing does feel kind of important, the perspective taking of like, look, A, nobody is perfect, and B, everybody has different stuff that helps them be the person that they are. We got to have an open mind about that and try not to cut people out unless there's something that really sort of disrupts your sense of ethics or personal values. All right. We do hope to be honest. I always say that clarity is better than honesty. I think we demand a lot of honesty from each other, and not everybody's ready to talk about everything all the time. You should be able to share personal information, and you should be able to manage a conflict if it happens. And those things are not bad. Those things do not necessarily mean your relationship is unhealthy. It's how you respond to those sort of things together that is a better indicator of the value of that connectedness. Okay, so let's say that you do meet somebody and you do hang out. Like, what do you do now? Try to be patient. Sometimes we get really focused on like, oh, well, I only hung out with them once and that doesn't really count. And it's like, well, that's a really good start. And at the same time, we don't want to be making rules about, well, if we don't hang out every week, then it's not a good friendship. People, this is one of those things about self-awareness. We all can know ourselves to know like what kind of commitment is it that we're looking for. And this is where having more than one person that you can approach for different things is going to be helpful so that you don't feel like you're keeping score with the friendships that you're trying to make. Also, feel free to invite. Next one. Once you build, just remember that you are building cred with that person. You're trying to build credibility. If you do feel like it's easier for the other person to keep up their end of the stick, but you're the one that's struggling to contribute to the relationship, that's okay. A lot of people do feel bad about that and will instantly say like, oh, they're so nice, but I don't do anything to them, or I don't help them. They always help me. I think especially in that interdependence model, we worry about that. Just work on whatever your version of reciprocity is. And remember, it doesn't have to be much to show somebody that you care about them. You can find a way to do it. Next, thank you, sorry. Keeping in touch. This is, you can actually go to the next slide because I know we're trying to wrap up a little faster. It's pretty easy these days if people use social media to quote unquote keep in touch, but that can feel really empty if that's the only thing that you're doing. So I use social media to keep me informed of my friends' lives so that I can go and say like, hey, I see that you are, you graduated last week. Congratulations. That's a lot different than just reading it on a screen. It's the basis with which I can interact with them by text or email in person. Don't feel afraid to set up a play date. It's always great to talk to people online. If you can see people in person, try to challenge yourself to do that in whatever sort of increment is comfortable for you, even if it's just a couple times a year. I have plenty of friends who I don't see all that often who are still really good friends, but having some component of in-person hanging out is great if you can have it. All right. And finally, don't succumb to this thing that we all do. And I'm more guilty of it than anybody else, which is I'm too busy. I'm too busy. I'm too busy. You're too busy. He's too busy. Everybody's too busy. We live in a society that totally glorifies busyness. And I think it becomes a barrier that we project onto other people and that we carry for ourselves. Some of those executive function strategies that we have are set repeating reminders on your calendars. Like, oh, I want to set up a Zoom or I want to set up a coffee date. It's been 2 months since I've seen my friend. Every 2 months, I just want to check in with her. Maybe you can make it a routine or a tradition so that it's a standing event like we talked about before. And if an event reminds you of someone, or if you're somewhere and you just think of them, try to build the habit of saying so. I send my friends texts all the time that just say like, ha, I saw this t-shirt and it reminded me of this. It may not be the thing that pulls us together in a personal event, but it's just reminding them like, hey, I'm thinking about you all the time, even if I can't be with you. Okay, so that's all I have for you. I think I went a little longer than I thought I would, so I'm sorry, but we do have a little bit of time for questions and Amy's going to come back and help us with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellie. What a great presentation and a lot of good stuff for us to think about. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for Q&A. Just some of those key takeaways. Epilepsy and seizures can impact social relationships in a multitude of ways. Social relationships are key to improving our overall health and well-being. And they take work, but it's work that's well worth it. And everyone is worthy of that social support and friendship. We have a couple of questions that came in. One in the very beginning, just asking what is the relationship between autism and Down syndrome? Is there a correlation there as well?
Oh, so just like the fast stats about this are that Down syndrome and autism can occur together, and they do all the time. Down syndrome has a component of it that's called intellectual disability. About a third of autistic people have some type of intellectual disability. By the way, about a third of autistic people have a history of seizures or epilepsy. So those aren't the same third necessarily, but there's always big chunks of our community. And
Yep.
I love people with Down syndrome and know plenty of people who do have both autism and Down syndrome.
Wonderful. Question came in. My family greets each other by hugging, and I am not a fan, but I've been taught to be aware of the social situation. How do I kindly and socially appropriately tell them?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. We talk about this all the time. If you're willing to speak up and advocate, I think is the hardest part. Or if you feel like you can't tell your whole family at once, or you don't want to send out the family email about it, find one person that you're interested in telling who can help enforce that advocacy for you, and think about what you would like to do alternatively. Most of the time, people don't like to be told not to do something, but if they're given an alternative, they're willing to do it. So I
Wonderful.
know a lot of families that get into the elbow bump, or I know one family where when they see each other, they touch fingers like this instead of hugging. Whatever it is that you are willing to do, see if you can't sort of latch onto that and model it for people to say like, oh, I'm not a hugger, but I will give you a high five, or I will give you an elbow bump, or whatever it would be.
And then one final question, and if we have other questions, we can always connect offline, connect you to Ellie or to us at EFMN. One final question though, from a parent of a young adult who's just entering college age, who has epilepsy, but also has autism, and they want to totally participate in the college experience, which might mean drinking, and any advice about that socialization piece for that age group as it relates to their diagnosis as well. I think it probably has to do with the fear of, in the epilepsy world, that might trigger a seizure. But do you have any other advice related to that?
Not good. I don't have a quick, concise answer for this, but what I will tell you is that some of the things we think about around autism and decisions to sort of partake in those kinds of social things, especially if you're underage, autistic people tend to be rule followers, and whether or not that's your person, sometimes it means that the dialogue that you have to evolve around it has to include some nuance about what my choice is as the autistic person and what my understanding is of why everybody else around me behaves the way that they do, even if it's not necessarily the healthiest or the best choice. That can be a hard thing for autistic people to navigate, and thinking about what that conversation sounds like. Autistic people have a lot of the same desires that typical people do. And for some folks, participating in, partying or drinking or, staying out late or doing whatever goofy kids do these days, I think all of that stuff is also related to our understanding of disabled people. And I hope I'm not ruffling any feathers when I say this, but we got to leave a little bit of room for that. Leading a disabled life doesn't necessarily mean we have to live in a bubble. It means we need supports and infrastructure to help us navigate those situations, so we know what to expect. We know what our boundaries are. We know what to do if we feel like, there's a problem that we have to solve. I don't think it's all that much different from if you had a typical kid who was dealing with these things. The point is to be explicit. What's hardest for autistic people is when the rules are unwritten. And that's when you can get into a slippery slope. So it might feel hard to talk about it directly, especially as a parent, if you're not really comfortable condoning college kid behavior directly. I know that's hard, but do you have a sibling that can engage in that conversation, or another loved one who can be the right resource for that conversation? You got to be able to find a way to be direct. And
Absolutely.
that's not you, find a buddy who's going to be the one who can take it head on, because that's what autistic people need, is directness.
And I would say, as it relates to the epilepsy piece of it, where there might be some medical event concerns, as far as having a seizure, is just to be really honest and have the conversation, have them have the conversation also with their healthcare providers, so that they know the medical pieces of it, and that it might be a trigger for them, as well as just that open conversation. Thank you so much, Ellie. I want to just say, just been another great experience working with you on this webinar. I know you're off to another meeting. And
Yeah.
so I just want to take this time to say thank you so much for the invaluable information. I know we're a couple of minutes over, but I'll let Ellie sign off so she can get to her other meeting, and just let everybody on the webinar know that this is our mission statement at EFMN. We lead the fight to overcome challenges of living with epilepsy, to excel in accelerating therapies to stop seizures, find cures, and save lives. We do provide one-to-one customized support through our information services. And that might mean that we connect you to AWESOM. We do that a lot. Or it might mean we connect you to something that would be whatever you are seeking information on. So please feel free to reach out as well to that. And then finally, I'm just kind of running through our references. But finally, I just want to put a note in here. Our next wellness webinar, Wednesday wellness webinar, will be September 29th. We are taking the month of August off, and it will be about effective communication in school settings for students with epilepsy. And we will have 2 school nurses joining us from across the state of Minnesota to give us that information. Thank you again for joining us, and a reminder that you will receive a follow-up email. We encourage you to participate in the feedback survey, as well as you will receive that certificate of attendance, and you will receive a follow-up email once the recording is also available on our website. Thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.